This is CinePunked. This episode, Orphée. Jean Cocteau's 1930 film Le Sang d'un Poète had been an exercise in bold experimental cinema, produced by a first-time filmmaker. By 1950, with several further filmic experiences under his belt, he returned to the world of mirrors, deaths, and poets in Orphée. Based broadly on the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, as told by the Roman poets Virgil and Ovid, Orphée is about a popular young poet who is forced to journey into the mirror realm in order to defy death and save his wife. Regulars to the CinePunked podcast will be aware that we have been exploring dreams and altered realities in our recent episodes, and in the last one we explored Le Sang d'un Poète in detail. Now we're going to run through Cocteau's Orphic Trilogy in successive episodes here, so we're at the midpoint, and let's see what we make today of Orphée. And continuing his induction into Cocteau and traversing the mirror, with me today is Neil Sedgwick. Say hi, Neil.
How's it going? Hello, everybody.
I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson, and from this point on, I will warn you there are spoilers ahead because, well, it's so much more fun to talk about a 70-year-old film whenever you can spoil it a little bit. So, Blood of a Poet we did last week, and that was your induction to Cocteau.
Yeah, who I have now become mildly obsessed with.
So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Blood of a Poet is not the easiest of films to get into. And I said in the last episode that when you got to things like Orphée, it was a little bit more commercial in view. So where's your kind of what is it that has suckered you in? I'm kind of intrigued by this because it's been so long since I kind of got suckered in. So it's nice to hear how somebody else has done it.
It's kind of fine. Well, I found Blood of a Poet really engaging and really even in its bizarreness, really compelling. And if I'm honest, when this film started, I was like, this is a real shift in gears, because this is much more linear storytelling. This is much more mainstream, like contemporary. You think of some of the contemporaries around that time, like it would fit more neatly into a mold of what we expect from cinema, I suppose, than Blood of a Poet. And I find this story, I actually found it more compelling once we got more into the underworld aspects more than the kind of build up to that, where we have our Orpheus walking around. Is it Paris? Is it Paris, or is it a French village?
It's certainly from Cocteau's own notes on it. It's Paris. So I'm assuming it's a Paris suburb, probably. Because it doesn't feel like the center.
It just felt very kind of normal drama levels until we discover the involvement of death in the middle of it all. And then it takes a turn, and I don't know if you want to kind of give us a wee breakdown synopsis wise.
Well, I mean, it opens up with Orphée, who is a very, very popular, exciting poet, going for lunch at the hip cafe where all the young poets and artists hang out, and there's a little bit of a conversation there, and then this other bright young poet, Suggest, gets into a fight and ends up being knocked down by a couple of motorbikeists. He is taken away by a princess in her big limo, and Orpheus is asked to join them as witness to the crime. And then the princess takes them to her house, where it transpires that the bright young poet has died. She then disappears she reanimates the bright young poet. They go into a mirror. Orpheus tries to follow them and is rendered unconscious. At that point, he then wakes up. He finds the chauffeur, and they go back to Orpheus's pad and his wife Eurydice. And from there, I'm trying to remember how this plot goes because I hadn't written this down. Once they go back there, he is obsessed with the princess and trying to find her again. and he is accompanied by the chauffeur Hertubus.
Yeah. He is also obsessed with the car radio.
He is, yeah, the car radio is
radio.
talking. He feels it's talking to him. It's giving out these messages, these sort of secret codes. It's very kind of resistance in the Second World War, kind of French resistance kind of messages, like, you know, not quite the cat sat on the mat and the cow jumped over the cuckoo nest or whatever, but it's that kind of, you know, there's weird stuff. There's poetry there. That's the thing. Yeah. There's poetry he's finding, and he's signing up. So he's gone missing for overnight. So the police have come along and they've tried to find out what's going on. There are also friends of the bright young poet who are concerned about his whereabouts, and they're trying to find out what's going on. And they now think that Orphée has actually kidnapped or killed the young man. It's very, very strange. And he then starts following the princess around the town. And it gets a little bit confusing, and then his wife is in turn knocked over by the same motorbikists, and she dies. And then Hertubus, who is revealed is a messenger of death or death, takes Orphée into the Mirror Land in pursuit of them. They all end up on trial. If you're following this at home already, you know, you're doing really well, but they all end up on trial. And
because they have messed with the natural order of things.
Yeah, the princess, it turns out, is Death. She is specifically Orphée's death, and she has broken the rules because she is in love with Orphée. Hertubus is in love with Eurydice, and they're all let go on a caution, basically. They're all bailed with the strict instructions that Orphée is never allowed to look at Eurydice again. So they're free to go back to the living world, but he can never look at her again, because if he does so, then she will disappear. And she's fed up and depressed. The whole thing is ridiculous, and he ends up catching sight of her in the car mirror whilst he is busy listening to the radio like the obsessive that he is. And Hertubus takes him back into the Mirror Land again. But this happens after Orphée is shot in the groin, interestingly, by a crowd of angry fans of the other fella. Suggest, and then they go into the Mirror Land. They where they find the princess. There's a declaration of love, and then she tells Hertubus to take Orphée back in time so that none of this stuff happens, and then it all ends happily ever after. I think that is,
or does it?
Well, I mean, that's a long old synopsis for you. I probably should have just read Cocteau's synopsis. Might have made as much sense and taken as long. Yeah, it's a bit of a melt of a film, and it's based quite loosely on the sort of the classical Roman poem, which I studied at school. I mean, they made us do Virgil and Ovid. I can't remember which version I did. I suspect it was the Metamorphoses version. So if you've been spared a classical education, Neil, you know, this stuff
I have, because that doesn't ring any bells with me at all.
I mean, it's fascinating. I love the stories, and then you sort of realize how much this stuff is come on in the future. Cocteau's reason for picking was he wanted to do a piece about poets, because he's a poet himself. He also says that if he had picked the name of a famous poet out of a hat, basically like made up one, nobody would have believed it. But somehow we believe in the characters whenever you use a name from history, and so he picked this one from classical mythology.
Which is interesting, because at the start of the film, he says, because there's a voiceover bit where he is kind of setting all this up, that it is an interpretation of the classic story, and he says, "A legend is entitled to be beyond time and place." Mm-hmm. This is the quote at the start of the film, which is, you know, there's we can tell so many stories over and over again in different ways and different, you know, it's that Joseph Campbell thing, the hero's path. There's a certain manner of telling stories, and the repetition of stories, not in a Chinese whispers way where things change, but almost like we adapt stories for the time that we're telling them in, and things like that, which I think kind of very much fits what he's attempting to do here.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing to bear in mind for anyone who's not familiar with this stuff is, or people who are slightly familiar with it, is that his version owes a little bit more to the sort of, there's a Victorian era retelling of it, Orphée or Orpheus in the Underworld, which was done for stage, and it sort of flips it around. It introduces humor into the story, which there isn't really in the original, and there very definitely is in Cocteau's version, and it sort of it adds the added complications of the going back and the sort of the besotment with death and stuff as well. I'm gonna quote a couple of Cocteau pieces as we go through this today, because I quite like what he has to say. He's got his pen. I like some of the stuff that he has to say on it, and I think it's useful whenever we look back at what we were discussing last week with The Blood of a Poet and try and understand what it is that he's actually doing. Where he called The Blood of a Poet a documentary, which we talked at length about. So what Cocteau says, he says, the poet is like the dead in the sense that he walks invisibly among the living and is only imprecisely seen by them after his death. That is to say, in the case of the dead, when they appear in the form of ghosts. So I'm going to put that down as a starting point in terms of our understanding of poets and death, because that's central to this. I mean, is it worth me reading the three themes that he himself says the film's about? Have you read this?
I think I might have this. I think now, if this is this, I do have a Wikipedia article here.
It is quoted quite liberally on the Wikipedia there.
Right. The successive deaths through which a poet must pass before he comes in that admirable line from Mallarmé, changed into himself at last by eternity. Mm-hmm. The theme of immortality, the person who represents Orphée's death sacrifices herself and abolishes herself to make the poet immortal. Mm-hmm. And mirrors, we watch ourselves grow old in mirrors, they bring us closer to death. Which, when that was said in the film, I was like, whoa, that blew my mind. That line just completely blew my mind. I was like, of course they do.
Yeah.
I've never thought of a mirror. Last time we talked about how we view ourselves in the mirror. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that every day, however we view ourselves or hold ourselves, every time you look in a mirror, you're a little bit older than you were than the time before, be that minutes, seconds, hours, days, whatever. So there is this idea of the mirror bringing you closer to death. And in this film, death travels through mirrors. Mm-hmm. Mirrors are the gateway, as they have been in Blood of a Poet, which is really interesting too. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've talked so much about mirrors as being a portal. I mean, in terms of the films that we've been chatting over recent weeks, that's what a mirror seems to function. It's a journey space from one reality into another. But this does add this whole extra level to it. This is saying that it's not just a journey, which, it's the journey from which no traveler returns. As to paraphrase Shakespeare. This is literally like staring death in the face. This is addressing our mortality. I guess it's why some people are so vain they don't like looking in the mirror. To have a vanity that looks in the mirror all the time, but to have a vanity that is so bad that you cannot look in the mirror, is something else.
After that line, I don't know if I'm going to look in the mirror again the same way.
It's a terrifying prospect.
It is when you open yourself up to that idea. And just because obviously so much of this film revolves around death, with death as a central character. Also quite interestingly to me, death presented not in the traditional kind of mythological way of, cape, scythe, anything like that. Death presented in this film as a
bloody sexy,
as a very beautiful woman, and almost and I don't mean this to be in a humorous way, but a very kind of Morticia Addams type when you think of that character, if you haven't seen this at all, if I say to you, Death in this film looks a lot like Morticia Addams from the Addams Family, that would give you an idea of the look of this character, I suppose. And it it even made me go, is that what they were doing in the Addams Family? Is that a death representation? Anyway, that's a total sidebar, but I couldn't help but notice the parallels. But yeah, death presented as a very beautiful woman in this. And there is a comment made in the film about why death is presented this way, because it would have no appeal.
Well, let me read you Cocteau on this.
Yeah.
I've got books this week. So he says, death in my film is not death represented symbolically by an elegant young woman, but the death of Orphée. Each of us has our own, which takes charge of us from the moment of birth. So Orphée's death, exceeding her authority, becomes Segeste's, and Segeste says to her, when she asks, do you know who I am? You are my death, and not you are death. So she is his death, she is Orphée's death, but also with that, Hertubis is also death. So
right.
He's not just Hertubis, he's not just an assistant, he is also the personification of death. He also says, realism in unreality is a constant pitfall. People can always tell me that this is possible, that is impossible, but do we understand anything about the workings of fate? This is the mysterious mechanism that I have tried to make tangible. Why is Orphée's death dressed in this way or that? Why does she travel in her roles? And why does Hertubis appear and disappear at will in some circumstances, but submit to human laws in others? This is the eternal why that obsesses thinkers, from Pascal to the least of the poets. So, I mean, he's winding us all up as always.
That's basically what he's saying. I do what I want, and you interpret it as you like.
Which comes back to what we said last week about the idea of the poet sort of working on impulse. I mean, he literally just sort of floats through the stuff, and it's whatever comes to his mind. I'm going to go and give you another quote from this one. He says that, and I think, sorry to be so quote heavy, but I think it helps us kind of get ourselves into his mindset, because he got quite annoyed by some of the people that were trying to put, again, a very straight linear interpretation on what he's doing, because that is not how he's thinking. He says, when I make a film, it is a sleep in which I am dreaming. Only the people and places of the dream matter. I have difficulty making contact with others as one does when half asleep. If a person is asleep and someone else comes into the sleeper's room, this other person does not exist. He or she exists only if introduced into the events of the dream. Sunday is not a real day of rest for me. I try to go back to sleep as quickly as possible.
Don't we all?
So, again, he also refers to this as a sort of documentary again, because he's still dealing with this idea of sleep. But it's a slight remove from Le Song d'un Poète. There is other stuff going on here. So if we look at this in terms of reality and dreams, I don't know. I'm convinced the whole thing's a dream. From the point where Orpheus bangs his head, that's your point to escape the narrative of the film and say this is a dream.
They do ask Orphée several occasions very early on, or they make statements to that effect, to kind of go, do you know you're asleep? And in some contexts, very early on in the film, he's having a conversation with somebody else who is a writer, and I took that to mean, he hadn't really produced any great work in a while, and that was why he referred to him as being asleep. And there's a couple of other references, but yeah, I think there is the possibility of, and again, going back to Blood of a Poet, where we're talking about delirium and insomnia and being in a dreamlike state, that there is a possibility for this all to be a dream, because some of the things that happen in it are so strange that it doesn't feel like any of it could be real, in the sense of like a real event, even in some of the things that go on in that kind of underworld space. But
Yeah.
again, that's the underworld, so who knows? All the rules are off.
Well, I think the problem with the logic in terms of understanding Cocteau's view is that for him, sleep is a reality.
Hmm.
That dreamscape is reality. It's almost like I mean, from what he said there about Sundays, he would rather be in bed asleep, because in the sleep, then you can dream, and the dreams are where the reality and where the stories happen. It's not the everyday mundane,
Yeah.
which is so counterintuitive, and I suppose if we look back at some of the other films that we've talked about, I mean, is Neo more real in the Matrix when he's in the dreamscape, or when he's in the reality? You know, the one of those worlds is, I mean, there's a world that people choose to live in. It's the same when
Yeah.
we talked about Free Guy. I mean, people are choosing to spend their entire lives in this animated computer world because
Where are
that's more
you?
real.
Where are you fully alive? Is the
Yeah.
question. You know, at what point are you fully alive? If I sit at my desk at work and daydream, hope nobody's listening to this from work. But if I go into a daydream of thinking about things that I have upcoming that I'm perhaps looking forward to more than my 9 to 5,
Mm-hmm.
where am I more alive, in that daydream or sitting at that desk? Do you know? So there is an argument to be made there, because the feelings that the daydream generates are more life giving potentially than the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, does that track?
I think it does. I've spent a lot of time trying to get my head around some of this stuff, and because I mean, some of it's philosophy, and it
Mm,
depends on whether or not you're into that philosophy. But I find our obsessions with dreams kind of fascinating. Um, I wonder myself where sometimes you come out of a dream and you wonder where the real you is. There's also a sense when you finish a dream that part of you's died.
mm,
So, I mean, he talks a lot about the fact that a poet has to die multiple times before he can really become alive, before he really finds himself. And I guess whenever you're dreaming, you are a person for however long it is you have that dream. And then when the dream ends, the dream ends. It's very seldom that any of us will have a dream that continues into another dream. That
yeah,
on successive nights, we will continue our narrative. Whereas when we come out of the dream, we come back into this world and we exist as per normal. It's like being killed off at the end of a computer game
yeah,
and then rebooting. Bring us back to Free Guy.
yeah. Going
You
back to
know,
your start point.
so I'm not sure. This is terribly enlightening kind of train of thought, but it's just what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is an awful lot about this that is obsessed with death and mortality and immortality, and the poet in this is in love with death.
Yeah,
But everyone's sort of in love with death.
yeah.
Or death's in love with people. I don't know. Which is it?
If you haven't considered the idea of death, you haven't considered that you're actually alive, because death is the inevitability. So you have to at least give death some uh, some consideration as you go.
Mm.
So for me now, um, you're reaching stages in life where you consider. I'm very fortunate. I have a 94-year-old grandfather still alive. That's, you start thinking at some point in the near future,
Mm.
he will leave us, and then that
Mm-hmm.
cycle shifts to parents.
Mm-hmm.
And as a parent myself, there's always things about, are my kids safe? Because I don't want, so there's, we have pets in the house. There's a certain limited mortality there,
Mm-hmm.
like death is something that you cannot avoid. Um, and its event makes you consider what life actually is. So to take my grandfather, when he uh, passes on, what am I gonna learn from that life, and what am I going to take from that life to pass on to my kids and for
Mm-hmm.
them to pass on? So th- those type of things. And I think you get to a point in life, like when I think of myself younger, like half my own life ago, I never considered death. There's a certain point in life where you feel, or certainly I felt, uh, not invincible, but the considerations aren't there. You know, I'm not thinking about what am I leaving behind? What's my legacy?
Yeah.
Will those I leave behind be financially secure? Like practical things, but also what am I teaching? What am I like? What am I passing on to my kids that I want them to see in other people and to see the good and the bad? So that they know what are the things to embrace and what are the things to avoid. As I say it, and those type of things. So like the death, the consideration of death is something that we all have to do and we all have to face. And sometimes it comes very naturally, and sometimes it comes, unfortunately, shockingly to us. And how we navigate that, I think, is something that we all have to consider and work through, I suppose.
Mm.
But I don't know. I don't know what that how that feeds into. That was just a random train of thought on what death means.
Yeah, but I don't think that our approach to film and these texts should necessarily just be about reading the text. It should be about how we emotionally respond to it. Cocteau himself talks about the experience of the film. He wants the films to be an experience. And part of that experience is feeling stuff. It's also about the thoughts that it puts into your head. And certainly watching these films makes me think about stuff, and it makes me replay some of my own life experiences or lacks thereof. And I mean, it just so happens that I am dealing with a lot of mortal dread at the moment. I've had some real issues recently with my own health, with health of family. I've had a bunch of friends have died, some of them dead old, and that's fine, sort of sad, but it's, we understand you get to an age and this is going to happen at some point. But also some of them were very young. They're my age and younger, and you go, that's not right, because I'm still too young, and if they're dying when they're younger than me, then my own mortality is surely a question. And then you go, have I done enough? You think about the things that you want to do and whether or not you're going to have time to complete them. And increasingly I start thinking about, I'm running out of time. And the worst thing you can do is to think I'm running out of time, because then all you do is you obsess about the time instead of just living.
And so that's where
you die prematurely.
Those ideas and those targets then face death as a consequence. So because if you think of, I won't get that done, then that target is effectively dead. But if you take that as a way of doing something to get, it's that thing of nobody knows how much time we have. You could walk out in the road and get hit by a bus by accident tomorrow, but
this podcast might never get edited.
Yeah, like I know, like we didn't mean to take into such a grim conversation, but this is what these films do. Like so death in this film never feels scary to me. You think of like horror movies, death representations. Even if you think of something like as warm and fuzzy as the Muppets Christmas Carol, didn't think I was going to invoke that, by the way. But when you get to the Ghost of Christmas Future, that pretty much appears in the form of what we think of when we think of what is death.
The Grim Reaper, yeah.
Grim Reaper, that type of thing. And like death is presented often as a scary thing. You think of what do you call those films where they killed people off? They annoyed death and death chased them. What do you call them? Final Destination. That was it.
Oh yes, yes.
Those films where death cannot be avoided is the takeaway from that, and death will find you, catch you, and there's no figure, but there is the event, in various grim, gribbly, and sometimes in those films towards the end, very comedic ways, like stuff that looked like straight out of a Looney Tunes flipping Roadrunner cartoon in some instances. But death in this film, I never felt any fear of death in this film.
Mm.
I never felt any fear of that. Even when they go in that underworld, afterworld, whatever way you want to refer to that, purgatory, possibly. I don't know. Not heaven, not quite hell either. I never felt.
There is a line, isn't there, about, I go to hell for, but we don't have to go that far, isn't that in this?
Yeah.
So it's not. We know it's not hell.
Yeah. To my mind, it was kind of an in between.
Well, you have that glazier, that young glazier running around the place trying to sell windows in a space where nothing has a window.
Yeah.
So purgatory, I think, is probably the most appropriate. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, not at all. But none of that ever felt scary to me.
No.
And I don't know if that is presentation or if that is connected into my own reaction to death and afterworlds and those type of things. But yeah, death in this film doesn't seem to be something to be feared. It quite literally is something to be embraced in the case of Orphée. Maybe not lovingly, but certainly it is something to be embraced. Maybe
it's a strange one. I mean, I think he's fascinated by death and he's obsessed with death and he's fixated on her, and I don't know that it's love because they've just met, and to me that makes no logical sense, but I know in cinema and in literature, love is something that just happens like that, and then you get married and you're happy ever after. It's not how it works in the real world, but if it does go that way, it's red flag time. But so I'm not convinced. I mean, she's obviously in love. His death.
Yeah,
the princess is in love with him, and I think she's been obsessing about him for a long time. She says, "I loved you before I even met you," but she's also been coming in and watching when he's been sleeping. But then, if he doesn't see her when he's sleeping, then she doesn't really exist, according to what we've just read. Those moments aren't real.
I love it.
It's only real whenever he sees her. If he doesn't see her, then it's not in the dream.
Yeah. Yes. I know. Mess with your head, but only that's what I'm saying. Only when you encounter death do you think of death in some ways. Only when you encounter, it's funny. Like this is why I'm becoming slowly obsessed with Cocteau, because he is pushing all my buttons, and I don't. Like that bit in Elf where he gets in the lift and just goes down all the buttons. That's what's happening to me when I watch this, because it's starting to melt my head a little bit, but in a really good way. I don't mean that in a bad way. It is challenging me, and it is provoking me, and it is making me think about what do I think about death, and those things. With the Films and Faith moniker, those things become, those things are talked about a lot, and in some ways, in that tradition, death is to be feared, because then you find out your destination point. And, well, there you find out that you're in for a rough time. But as I said last time, I find the idea of heaven in the church sense as equally boring and hellish. Frustrating. Yeah. I said this once on Twitter. I said sometimes heaven sounds like hell, and then somebody slid into my DMs to check my my theology and that dilemma. And you can read about that on filmsandfaith.substack.com if you so wish, because I did write about that. But those things are in the ether when you're in the religious circle, you know.
Yeah, and we talked about this last week as well. I mean, Cocteau himself is sort of from a Catholic background. I mean, that religiosity, I guess, is inherent in his work. But also when you're looking towards the Greek and Roman myths, who are also obsessed with this. I think the thing about all of this stuff is it's the unknown. So I mean, you could watch this film in a very, very straight way. You could just, because it is almost a straight linear narrative of a film. He describes it as a thriller that also includes little elements of the supernatural, and those elements of the supernatural he tries to downplay. He tries to make it as realistic to a modern audience as he can, which is why you got the voices coming through on the radio, because everyone has a radio. They understand that stuff. So it feels real. Motorbikes feel real. Like death comes by on a motorbike. Yeah, okay, that does happen. Like, you know, I knew someone who got killed by a bus. You know, like these things are what goes on, as opposed to some specter coming out of nowhere and sort of exploding your insides or something. You know, like so. Like there's a logic within this as well, but there's something else at play with this. It's not just a straight narrative. There is other elements. This supernatural thriller is sort of swamped in mythology and philosophy. So for, I mean, I think that this is probably a more accessible film for somebody who's not massively into testing their noggin with film than Blood of a Poet was. It's
certainly not as surreal. It is certainly much more linear and more structured, more what was it we talked about last time? More
linear calls. I think it's linear causal narrative is clearer. Like everything seems to follow on. Is this more poetic? He does talk about orchestrating this. He uses the word, he orchestrated it for this film, which would suggest poetic rather than poetry. But there does seem to be a poetry there, or there's poetry within it. Interesting that we kind of say this is less surreal, considering how much Cocteau hated the definition of surrealism for Blood of a Poet. Because,
and again, I say surreal as a very kind of accessible word,
but I think
to describe that.
I think it is, though. I mean, Blood of a Poet I probably should describe better as an avant-garde film, which is what gets tied in with the avant-garde movement. This is almost commercially enterprising. It is much straighter, at least on the surface. But I think it is surreal. I think that when you're dealing with the supernatural, there's always an element of surreality in it. Also, we very explicitly talk about sleeping and experiences when sleeping, and the surrealist movement always seems to be tied in with that unconscious sleeping self. So I think it's a bit more. I think it'd be harder for Cocteau to turn around and say this isn't a surrealist film, than it would be for Blood of a Poet. Although, I mean, there's an element where I kind of think some of his arguments are disingenuous. He's just being contrary for the sake of being contrary.
But I think there's a bit of him goes, if you think that, that's fine. If you think this, that's fine. Whatever, you know.
Yeah.
He's very much in that kind of UDU type energy.
There's another line. There's a couple of lines in the film that I quite like, but there's one in particular I've written down here. It says, "What does marble think when it is being sculpted? It thinks, I am struck, insulted, rushed, lost. Life is sculpting me." I'm going to use that in my Twitter bio.
Yeah. Try getting a match on Tinder with that.
I might do that tonight.
It's like, and again, to come back to what is alive and what is dead, the idea of marble having a presence of thought, having a consciousness of thought. This is where we're into the philosophical, and there's so much philosophical thought in this that seems abstract and odd to drop into this kind of story, but
But it's also harkening back. I mean, when we take this as the center of three films that are linked, I mean, he talked about statues and obsession. The problem with like obsessing about taking down statues is that eventually become one.
Yeah,
is what he says in Blood of a Poet. But statues, which actually suggests in itself a transmogrification from life to inanimate form. We know that the statues themselves are composed and crafted and sculpted in order to represent a reality. What is the difference between them and us? Nothing. I mean, the statues in Blood of a Poet are alive. They are alive within the context of the film. So,
yeah. And we are sculpted and molded by the world around us, by influences, family influences, all sorts of things. Like, so sculpting and molding between the human frame and the marble. Yeah, okay, I can see it. Like, I am the way I am because of my lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, that's a process of sculpting, molding, refining.
You're a parent. I mean, a parent will try and mold their child to fit. I mean, traditionally we do it in our image. The same way, to take the Christian philosophy, humanity is molded in God's image. Therefore, there is a sculpting that goes on in order to create life.
Yeah,
we need that in order to be alive. But at the same time, you can only sculpt so much because people have to have their own experiences. You mentioned love whenever we were chatting just before we started recording. You had a question.
A preamble. I have a question about love in this because the traditional story of this is that Orphée and Eurydice are very much in love, separated, and this offer from death comes about as a kind of almost like a wager. You can't look at her after she returns, knowing that it will fail at some point.
And in the original story, it feels just as they're about to leave the underworld.
Right.
He can't hear her.
Yes.
And he starts to doubt whether or not she's actually behind him. And just at the last minute, the reference that they make within this film is they talk about the pillar of salt. They talk about Lot.
Yeah, Lot's wife. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who loses her faith and turns back and gets turned into a pillar of salt.
Yeah.
So that's when it happens there. That's not where it happens in Cocteau's version.
No, it happens later on. But I didn't feel during the film that Orphée and Eurydice are particularly
in love.
In a massively loving, well, not in love, but not in a loving relationship. Certainly from him to her, I feel like she very much dotes on him and is very supportive. There's lots of chat around supporting his work early on and the importance of him in the world and things like that. But the counter to that from him towards her is very dismissive and harsh at times. I said to you before we recorded, I don't know that it would, like, in terms of being an abusive relationship, I didn't feel it was done with any real malice, but it certainly wasn't the most loving and endearing relationship. Or is that because he encounters death and then finds that more attractive, and there's more, it's not love in the death thing, there's more of a lust there, which isn't in his actual marriage? Would that be fair?
I guess in part there's not enough information within the film for us to make a complete judgment call on it, so it's about our interpretation and how we experience the film, and that's also probably coloured by the way that we've experienced our own romantic relationships within our lives. It strikes me that this is a kind of relationship that is quite common and probably was even more common back then, and probably completely common in France, where traditionally, apparently, men had mistresses all the time and nobody bats an eyelid. There is a conversation that they have about he's gone off with some floozy, basically. And, he's a bloke, this is what happens, he'll come back, don't worry about it. It's almost like an expectation.
Do you know what was really interesting about that conversation too? They go looking for him at several hotels, and one of them is a hotel of the hot springs with this woman, and one of them is a hotel between worlds, is the translation. The hotel de deux mondes.
Hotel Two Worlds, yeah.
And my GCSE French.
I can see his wee face going right now. He's like,
hello.
Is that another moment?
I'll have a Google of that to find the translation. So very, very interesting hotel names in relation to that. But yeah, the inference being that he's just away having it away with somebody. You know?
Yeah, it seems to be, and there's not a massive concern about that either. I think that he strikes me as being a rather narcissistic individual.
Yeah.
And let me pick up on that in a second. So I think there's an element of being in love with himself, being obsessed with himself. Again, onanistic, masturbatory kind of indulgence. Again, harkening back to Blood of a Poet. I mean, we haven't even touched on the homoeroticism that exists within the film and its casting. We'll save that for Testament, Orphée. I don't know. Are they in love? The way it ends in a real kind of tender moment, and it's almost as if they have to go through the experience of losing each other in order to find themselves, which again possibly fits in with the idea that you have to go through multiple deaths in order to become real, and he has to die multiple times because he goes through the underworld twice. He has literally died twice in order to get out of that whole system. In fact, is it twice he's died? Is it 3 times? It's just twice.
It's twice, I think.
So there is
when he eventually returns to the real world at the film's conclusion, then it appears to be a very loving relationship, very tender, and she is pregnant as well.
I mean, is it a chance that he's maybe this is all a dream? That the whole experience is part of his dream fantasy, where he feels that he's becoming the person that he wants to be, to live the life that he thinks he should do, but actually discovers that this isn't who he is at all, and the person that he is the person that loves his wife.
Potentially. Cocteau probably goes, whatever. Yeah, maybe not.
I mentioned narcissistic there. Kind of, it strikes me as something I should pick up on as well. It occurred to me earlier. Narcissistic from the Echo and Narcissus story. Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection and wastes away. Again, there's this I'm feeling kind of connections back to the sense of the mirror being the representation of death. It's through death that we see, through our reflection that we see death, that death exists. I mean, it literally kills Narcissus by staring at himself. That's why you're better off looking away for a while, coming back when you're grayer. But it's not even just Cocteau that's looking at this way. It's embedded in, in ancient mythology. Yeah.
All those things, how we view the self, how we view death, how we look at love, what we feel about love. Like it's all within the bones of this, I think. And yeah, I didn't quite think of him. Well, he does. Yeah, he is a bit narcissistic, actually. Like just in how he refers to himself, he finds the suggest like a challenger. Like he has taken some of his fame, and yet he seems quite jealous of that because he seems to be the young up and coming poet of the moment. So it seems to be competition very early on that he's not keen on. Also, it feels like that village that he lives in has fallen out of love with him initially at the start, because a lot of people move away from him and separate themselves off from him, dismiss him quite quickly and rudely at the film's beginning when he's around kind of more village folk and stuff like that. So there is an ego edge to this which is struggling in the real world. He also just narcissistic and selfish to the point, even when we're talking about the car and he becomes obsessed with this radio, these messages, snippets of poems or thoughts which turn out to suggest communicating from the afterlife. It's revealed much later on. I originally thought that was Cocteau reading just bits and excerpts and things like that when I first heard it, because the voice doesn't sound like the character in the film.
Yeah.
When it comes through the radio. But so then he finds himself enthralled by the work of this poet that
he's jealous of.
Who he's jealous of. And his ego and his narcissism also has an effect on that loving relationship too, because he is determined to go and sit in this car and hear this great poetry and write it down and craft it into something over and above the relationship with his wife, with his pregnant wife. And that selfishness could be seen as narcissistic as well. Like, this is much more important than you are. So I'm going to go and do this and sit in this weird car.
And literally walk over the clothes that you're making for our baby.
Yeah, it doesn't even acknowledge. She drops a child's sock or booty or something. And he literally stands on it and doesn't acknowledge its existence.
Because he's so blinkered. I mean, he's so caught up with himself. He's so focused. I mean, it's slightly... it's obviously complex as well, because then you've got issues where his points where he gets mobbed by people looking for autographs, also suggest is utterly incompetent and almost infantile. Yeah, it's interesting. Just on the love thing as well, can I ask you this about how the film ends? Yes, of course you can.
So towards the end of the film, we have they go back to the real world, what we seem to be the real world, and he is told, you can't look at Eurydice or she will disappear forever. And it almost becomes quite comedic at points, because she's like diving under tables to avoid his gaze and all. It's
brilliant. I love that lightheartedness.
It goes a wee bit kind of carry on, like whoop, and like it's people jumping into his.
It's a French farce at that point, and it's deliberately played comedic as well. I mean, it's not like it wasn't an accidental comedy. It was meant to be comedic.
Yeah, and it's a lovely bit of lightness into what is quite a serious film. But then they go and they sit in the car. They're all together, and she is told, like, you have to be really careful because she's trying to lovingly like stroke his neck and nuzzle him and things like that. And then he glances her in the rear view mirror of the car. But I wondered at that point, because it almost looks like she adjusts his gaze, like she's doing all this kind of affectionate rubbing of the neck. He is not engaged in this at all, or really that into it, until the kind of final moment. And then it felt like she moved his eyes into the mirror. He sees her and she's gone. And I thought, had she just had enough at that point?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think yes. I think for her it was an impossible situation. I think it's a deliberate attempt at trying to escape what's going on. It's to bring an end to this horribleness.
It would be quite torturous, in terms of afterworlds and hell talk that we've engaged a lot in here. Like that is quite a torture, to think this person can still be around you, but you can never look at them.
Yes. No, completely. I'm just trying to say, what does he say on this? So Cocteau's own synopsis of this describes the sequence. He says, Orphée's allowed to take his wife back on condition that he never looks at her again. Herchbees will help them to abide by this clause. They soon understand how difficult it will be. Feeling that she will never again be able to recover Orphée's love, Eurydice tries to die for the second time by forcing her husband to look at her. At last she succeeds and disappears forever. So it is a deliberate... The intention was always that she's deliberately trying to do it because she feels that she's lost him. I think that she is aware that she has lost him to his obsession with death, but also because they are not able to interact as a couple. Like, how can you do that? How can you bring up a child whenever you are not able to interact fully.
Yeah.
And considering that part of the problem seems to be that he keeps on running out the bedroom window and gallivanting off via his ladder in an inverse of a teenager trying to sneak into someone's bedroom, he's always on the way out. And that's something that's tacitly acknowledged. I mean, when you have someone that's in that kind of existence already, to then go and create a situation where they have to live separate lives.
Yeah.
It's almost like an enforced separation, enforced divorce.
Do you know, it's interesting you say that about climbing out the window, because the bedroom is up like a ladder, and he continually refers to that as a trapdoor.
Mm-hmm.
And a trapdoor to me refers to, when you go down a trapdoor, you are in a dungeon, you're in a basement, you're in a place of torture.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, is there a bit where he sees that kind of domestic life underneath the bedroom as a place of or a form of torture in some ways? Because why else call it a trap door, not loft door, or something like that? I wonder.
I mean, I wonder how much of this is down to translation as well.
It could well be.
But I mean, that also makes you think of when I'm thinking about what actually happens in the bedroom. There's not an awful lot apart from her death and resurrection, transversion through the mirror. But that is the kind of the first level of underworld, in a way as well. In fact, I suppose it's our only underworld, because whenever they're in through the mirror, that's not necessarily under the ground. It's just in a dark twilight space. Yeah. It's causing lots of questions here, Neil.
Isn't it? It really is. And I don't know where we're going next. But,
so you have no idea what's ahead of you for.
Oh no, I have no clue.
Excellent. So
no spoilers.
No spoilers.
I haven't gone looking. I want to do so. I've referred to my Cocteau obsession. So what I'm doing is I'm just kind of finding the art and pictures of the man and doing to kind of give me some reference point for him. But I'm not looking at these films ahead. I want to take them, look at them, react to them here, and then I want to do the thing where I go and get like the art of cinema, and I sit with that and I read it and I get his informed view on what he is doing to his mind. So I have no clue what's coming next. But flip me, if it keeps, the insomnia vibes of this, like if I think about this too much, I'll just lie and look at the bedroom ceiling all night.
This may explain my recent problems with lack of sleep.
I'm just
the two are feeding into each other.
Rattling these things around continually. Like this, I joked many episodes ago, what are we doing here? Are we doing a film podcast? Are we doing philosophy? Are we doing therapy? For goodness sake, what are we doing?
All of the above. That's the secret. Well done.
All of it. As long as people are entertained by it.
My gosh, I mean, like some of our live events have definitely been therapy for people in the room. I mean, it's a weird process. Well, look, I mean, I'm loving the fact that you've been so into the films and enjoying this journey too, and it's a really interesting experience for me to introduce a filmmaker to somebody else and literally see them going through a journey and their responses, and we presumably will feel differently about these things, but there's an interest there, which is great. So testament for those of you listening and watching, go and check out Orphée. It's available on Blu-ray and it's on streaming services, and just go and check it and watch it out. And if you were hesitant about Blood of a Poet, or you find it too difficult, this is probably a lot easier to get into, I think. Yeah. In the next episode, we're going to cover the final part of the Orphic Trilogy, the Testament d'Orphée, the Testament of Orpheus, if you have to have an English translation. I'm not going to say very much about it, apart from everything. There's a reason we're doing the trilogy. Okay. What you've seen in Blood of a Poet and what you've seen in Orpheus are both going to play a part in Testament of Orpheus, which is going to take you somewhere else entirely. Okay. It is. Yeah, as a trilogy, it's a bit of a head melt, but it's so much more satisfying. And I just sort of realised that this is a trilogy that takes place over 30 years. I mean, we talk about really long sequels. Gaps at the moment is a big thing where Marvel franchises are coming back years later.
Back to Matrix again.
I mean, literally, there's 20 years between Blood of a Poet and Orpheus, and there's another 10 years between Orpheus and Testament of Orpheus.
Yeah.
So, like, it's interesting that we have that as well. So, Neil, thank you very much for.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for
doing this, and I'm looking forward to our next little chat.
I'm excited to see where we go next. To be honest, I'm a little scared.
Rightly so. Folks at home, hopefully you've enjoyed. If you have enjoyed or you haven't enjoyed, do let us know. Contact us on various social media platforms. You know the score by now. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all sorts of places. Also check out our website, CinePunked.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, do give it a subscribe if you've not listened before, on whatever your platform of choice is. Tell your friends about it too, and we will catch you again very, very soon. Until then, cheerio.